I think the hard part for this interview might be is being serious at all.
I also just I don't know what to talk about.
Yeah. I'm John Totten, and this is Between Us.
How long these little chats you do take?
Sessions typically last 50 minutes.
Okay. But you charge by the hour, right?
That's correct. I take it you're not a fan of this kind of work.
No, ma'am.
Why's that, do you think?
You want the truth?
I'm only interested in the truth, Ted.
Because I think it's bullshit. You don't know me. We don't have history. And yet you just expect me to spill my guts about all the gory details of my life. The fights, the mistakes, my deep, dark secrets. But you ain't listening because you care about me. No, you only listen to me because you paid to listen to me. You getting paid to just jot down your little notes and diagnose my tears, and then what? Probably just blame it on my folks, right? I mean, you say you're only interested in the truth, and yet here you are, charging an hourly rate for only 50 minutes of work. Like I said, it's bullshit.
Well, it's been our longest gap between episodes ever, and a lot of stuff has changed both in the world and in my own life. We last published an interview over 2 years ago. I was on paternity leave for the birth of my second daughter. It was a lovely spring in Seattle, and I was enjoying the downtime of cuddling with the new baby and working on my lawn when her older sister was in daycare. It was just over a year into the COVID-19 pandemic, and the space and time of the work-from-home era felt like some kind of decompression, even as the world around us seemed to be crumbling. We spent our last session exploring the potential for psychoanalytic thought and psychotherapy to address the ills of society, and my take was that the consensus seemed to be, of course, but not necessarily in obvious ways. As you'll hear in our episode today, that question doesn't just go away. Even when I intend to have more directionless conversations, many of the interviews find their way to this topic. Therapy as a practice is more aware of culture than ever, and it seems the inverse to be true as well. The media we take in seems to be more therapy aware than ever. Sitcoms make it not only the topic of a whole TV season, but the premise of the show itself. Infotainment sites like Huffington Post are replete with op-ed and think pieces about whether therapy is good in the first place. I have single clients who tell me that there are people on dating apps who advertise that they won't date you if you aren't in therapy. In an era in which our technology has allowed everyone to amplify their opinions on everything from politics to the validity of medical science, therapy has no immunity as well. Everyone has an opinion about what therapy should be and what your therapist should be doing. If I go to a party, I will inevitably get asked what I think of Ted Lasso's therapist or about the ethics on display in the Apple TV show Shrinking. It can be fun, but for a guy who spent 12 years realizing that no one at a cocktail party wanted to hear about my job, it's also a bit startling. And surprising that sometimes I prefer it that way. I've been enjoying my job since I talked to you last, but part of that is that I've become even more compartmentalized towards it. I take some time to decompress after each day at work, and then I tend not to think about it if I don't have to. There are diapers to be changed, beaches to explore, episodes of Bluey to watch, and my own interests to pursue. My creativity in my alone time has become more important to me than ever. I found myself taking the moments away from the hubbub of work and kids to go on quiet drives with a camera, chasing a sunset or a view, shooting photos of landscapes and city scenes. I rediscovered the film cameras from my high school art days and the enjoyment and mindfulness of loading a camera, winding the film up, manually focusing a lens, and triggering the shutter. What was once a hunger that was satisfied by this podcast and all the time it consumed became directed at something far less intellectual and more in the moment. It has been a near blissful pursuit when everything therapy related and parenting related can be so hard-earned and sweaty. It was my silent and taciturn other life. What brought me back to this show was something that is now hilarious to me. I went to a doctor's office for labs, hopped up on coffee and dehydrated, and got a bit of a scare when the results appeared to be indicative of kidney problems. It wasn't kidney problems, it was just a bad day, and my wife, a nurse, reassured me that I should get a second take. But for those few days, I thought a lot about mortality and what I was creating for my daughters and the world after my existence. The podcast was my best answer. I've mentioned it before, but I see this podcast as an attempt at some kind of archive of my closest colleagues as well as my most respected thinkers. So that week, I started booking some interviews. And I'm happy to say I got some really exciting responses. I also wanted to use this season to go back to an earlier format we leaned heavily on in the early days, just me hanging out with friends I have made in this field. So that's where we're starting out today. Our first guest is my friend Caleb Williams. We met each other in graduate school over a decade ago, and we've worked in some of the same offices as community clinicians. When I was ready to get going again on the show, he was the first person I called. He was also the first in-person interview I've had since the pandemic started. If it sounds like we're just two pals sitting around a dinner table, that's because this is what it literally is. I went over to his house, he made me dinner, and after dinner, we pressed record. What have you been reading lately?
I just finished a long Neville Symington book that I'm in love with, The Analytic Experience.
What do you like about it?
I feel like I could read the last chapter and just explode about how good it is. He has a way of talking about every sort of influential analytic idea and helping it make sense to people whose minds don't necessarily click with a lot of the jargon, the analytic jargon, really quickly. Yeah. He has such a deeply empathic view of being an analyst. It feels like he loves people.
Mm. Okay, so you know what I'm thinking about as we're talking is I don't think I think of you as another therapist a lot of the time, which I think is a benefit to our friendship. We have so many other, my brothers, we both play music, there's so many other points of contact that I don't, I have, when you say that you came to one of my shows, your first year of grad school, I was like, yeah, because you're my friend. Of course you came to one of my shows.
Yeah. I actually think until one of the last times we hung out within the last couple of years was maybe the first time I even remember talking to you about psychoanalytic theory or therapy or any of that. All of my conversations with you that I ever remember, talking about the drumming of Keith Moon or some shit like that.
I think one of the first thing we bonded over was Bonnie Prince Billy.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to have to ask you questions that I feel like I already know.
Okay.
But tell me who you are.
I'd almost rather you answer that. I'm curious to hear how you'd answer that.
Caleb Williams, you're from Colorado. You grew up in a family with siblings. I know that there is a brother, at least one brother, maybe two, maybe three.
Yeah, two.
Two, and a sister.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
I'm the oldest, which I very much feel like.
You're the oldest.
Yeah.
Me too. Mm-hmm. I think we probably have bonded over that before. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think we've bonded over having grown up in Christian culture, playing music that wasn't Christian music. And then we both came to Seattle. We're around the same age. You're a little older than me, but you were in the cohort behind me. And I think of you as taking your work very seriously in a way that benefits your patients. I don't think of you as necessarily all the time serious with me, which benefits me. But I think of you as someone who doesn't take the work you do lightly. And I think you're probably my most kind of theoretically driven friend in the field. But I don't know if I know exactly where you are with that. I think at one point I thought you were oriented towards object relations more than me, which may be true, may not. I don't know. This is probably where you should take over.
That was really sweet. That was really sweet. Yeah, I spent a lot of time in object relations just trying to like feel like it sunk in. Neville Symington in the last chapter of the analytic experience, he has chapters where he talks about different analysts. It might be in Bion or it might be in Winnicott. He talks about subjective knowledge, the difference between knowledge that we're sort of just regurgitating and how meaningless it is for us as well as our patients, and how important it is for patients to experience something making sense to them in a subjective way. All of us, I think, can tell when somebody's speaking just regurgitating pastiche of information as opposed to a subjective truth, a subjective experience where the knowledge is coming from. I tried forever to internalize and understand object relations. I feel like it did make a lot of sense of it. I find it useful now. I perpetually go back to the language. I don't know, maybe I'll write an article or something. I like the idea of just writing about the jargon with a kind of translation, just to make it easy. Trying to put Bion or Lacan into language that's accessible feels like it would be very challenging, but just the ideas of the penis and the breast and the...
Explain it to me.
I know.
Well, I mean, what do you think drew you to that in the first place? What I hear you saying is that you're not as intensely there as you used to be, but that it still always kind of will be part of your language.
It's always challenging to be in session, to be in a face-to-face hour. It might have been Symington. He says something like, I'm afraid before every session. I walk into every session with fear. And that feels real to me. And it's not the same kind of anxiety it was when I was just beginning, where the unknowns were much more around me failing the other person and getting in trouble, me being unfavorable to them, me getting yelled at, all of the fantasies of like somebody being angry with me. What shows up now, I think, is something more like being sensitive to the fact that I can't know what I don't know about somebody. I can't know what they're going to bring. I can't know what they don't know. The unknown is so deep in all of us. And to have a respect for that. I was attracted to the world of object relations, I think, because it felt like it gave a roadmap. Just how to approach the unthought thoughts.
I'm calling my brother David.
Hey. Is it working? Yeah, I think it's working. Okay. So, how did you meet Caleb? I think the first time I met Caleb was at a show. You know, the fundraiser that we... Yeah. I just feel like you knew him way before that, but maybe not. Our other brother knew him earlier. Yeah, independently. From working in bars. Right. Yeah. And you knew him from school, and I think that he was here at the show, and I think that, I don't know if you invited him or anything, but I remember ending up like talking outside with him. And the funny thing about Caleb is that he's so familiar in so many ways that I wouldn't be surprised if you thought that somehow we knew each other. Right. But he's, because he just dives in and tries to get to know people as fast as possible. Right. I remember talking with him for a really long time, but I think that was the first time that I had actually met him. That's a way more interesting answer than I was expecting, because that's like really recent in my memory. Like, then you ended up playing in a band with us. Yeah, much later. I mean, playing in a band with him was certainly something that brought us even closer. But I mean, we had gotten pretty close before I asked him to play. That was one of the reasons why I wanted him to play in the band, is because I liked Caleb. He was very reliable. He's very kind. I just wanted to be around people that I really appreciated.
Oldest sons who grew up to become therapists. Do you like those types?
Yeah. Sure. And, he was really excited about playing music. So, it made a lot of sense at that time. But, I mean, we had already hung out quite a bit. And I'm trying to think of, like, the types of things.
In the ranking of people you saw the most during the pandemic, would he be, like, top 5 or top 10?
He'd be less than top 5. He'd be in the top... Yeah, probably top 4 of people that I actually hung out with and spent time with during that.
Damn.
Yeah.
3 words, 3 adjectives. What would you? How would you describe them? Because I don't want too much to edit. I better wrap this thing up.
Yeah. Curious, kind, skilled.
Great.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, buddy.
Yeah, sure.
Talk to you later.
All right, man. Bye.
Bye.
I have a lot of hope in being able to use analytic ideas to get a deeper understanding as to why everything that persists.
What do you mean?
Patriarchy, white privilege, inequality throughout power structure.
So you mean as a way of understanding society too?
And myself.
Okay.
I'm regularly still making my way through my own grief.
Well, I gotta ask what that means.
Which part?
What grief? What is the grief that you're continually working your way through?
I think every time I have a relational rupture that I don't know how to make it through. Mm-hmm. And within that relational rupture, when I find myself holding so tight to something that to let go just feels intolerable. Now I end up recognizing how young I feel in those moments, and recognizing just the relational harm that can happen by just holding something so tightly that I can't let it go. Meanwhile, the relationship is sort of aching and needing to change or transform.
Right. It sounds like oldest child stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
Like as you're talking, I'm thinking about the sense of responsibility that I feel as an older brother, and the terror and it can cause, and also like how the ruptures feel like failure.
Yes. Yeah, and just very scary when it means trying to deconstruct something that also feels like your whole identity rests on something continuing to exist in the way that it always has, and then recognizing that unless you hold that loosely, a relationship is going to end.
Right. Well, that sounds like a political slogan of recent years, right? Like, the idea that we can keep the past current and make the current into the past and make it great again.
Yeah, no kidding. I remember a conversation with a friend of mine that I had become what I thought was really close because I often helped her with her problems and we were buddies, and but I really served a really helpful role in her life. And at one point in a conversation, she's like, I want to get together and talk about your stuff too. I want to, what shit do you have going on? I'd love to help you with your problems. And I remember, I think I'm in my early 20s at this point. I remember kind of having this sort of robot glitch moment. I don't have any problems. I'm good. Everything's fine. I'm really okay. And really believed it. I wouldn't say that there was anything to grieve at that point about my childhood, my relationship with my parents. And I've really become deeply convinced that as an analytically informed therapist, a lot gets in my way when there's territory that hasn't been really sweetly thought through and grieved and have some grasp of understanding around the defenses at play in any kind of narcissistic need that shows up.
Tell me more. How are you using that word, and particularly in regards to yourself?
Need for attention. Growing up, I never would have said I need attention.
That would be really sophisticated for a child to be able to say it that way.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, it's sophisticated for an adult, right?
I still don't think that actually goes over very well, especially for men. I think there's a fantasy that men will just be able to speak very fluidly about how needy they are. I don't think it actually goes very well. I don't think any of us expect it, know what to do with it.
There's a bit of a hypocrisy about what we want men to be. We want them to be sensitive and in touch with their emotions, but we don't want them to be needy. We want them to be tough.
I think it's really hard to hold in the same two hands. We've only got two hands, let's say, and it's very, very hard to hold in both hands a really important hatred of maleness while also holding a sensitivity to the human frailness of maleness as well. It can be very challenging for me to face feeling sloppy and needful, incapable and insecure. These are all feelings in me that feel like they go against masculinity when they are inherently a part of masculinity.
Of humanity.
Exactly. But I also think uniquely masculinity as well.
Side note, which by the way, talk about like masculinity and your insecurities about it. And then I think of you as someone who can like build your own house, which probably is related to the insecurities about masculinity.
Well, there's probably so much in it too, because I think I can build my own house, and then I am doing some of it well and doing some of it maybe dangerously unwell.
That just shows how unmasculine I am, because it all looks really nice to me. In that stereotype. You can hear me realizing that I'm in a safe space to discuss something I don't usually discuss. And that's the fact that men are suffering in the category of mental health. Suicides and death by drug overdose are heavily disproportional towards men, and they are falling behind in the academic sphere. It's a hard thing to talk about in our political climate without sounding like I'm alt-right or some kind of men's rights activist. But the data don't lie. Men may hold positions of power and may have unfair wage advantages. But in many other ways, they are struggling disproportionately. And I don't trust my own political culture to talk about it effectively. We love to talk about how masculinity is toxic. But the message that is getting heard is that men are toxic. I know that part of getting out of that toxic masculinity is to address some sort of need. But Caleb is right. In so many ways, men having needs is not acceptable on either end of the political spectrum. I don't have any quick answers, but to get the problem acknowledged seems important, and I was glad to hear Caleb point it out.
Early on, Freud didn't do much around the idea of the phallus was everything. The phallus was the focus, and so potency, impact, in a lot of ways, it was a big focus. And there was, therefore, phallus envy. There was penis envy.
Right.
To think about the early female was to think about what she didn't have.
Right.
Because in his mind, the penis was the sort of standard. What this author goes into is the idea that it is not just the phallus that has impact. There's a potency. The phallus also is impacted by being held. And quote-unquote femininity. That the holding itself is actually inherently impactful, and that it has a potency, that there's absolutely a potency to holding that is really not delved into at length in classical analytic theory until the feminists and until queer theory and relational theories. There's something about really truly dealing with what it means to be held and how psychically important that has always been in analytic theory, and yet not seen as a part of masculinity because it's not phallic, quote unquote.
Right. Our first penetrative act was taking in the nipple.
Right?
Yes,
exactly. And receiving can actually happen with aggression. That there can be an aggressive receiving.
Yes.
Whoever the infant is, there can be an aggressive taking in of the milk. The way that narcissism, I think, shows up so often in our culture are, assholes in the positions of power who can't tolerate how aggressively they need to receive. Narcissists essentially just can't tolerate rejection. I think there's something to an intolerance of one's own hunger to be impacted, to be received, and to receive, which in clinical language might be classically talked about as more feminine. What that other analyst, again, I can't remember his name, talks about is the shame is that it's been thought of as a masculine idea to have an impact, to have power,
To insert,
to penetrate is a masculine idea, but that little boys' first experience is of identification with mom.
yeah.
And that there's a great anxiety that shows up when there's a recognition that, wait, I don't have what mom has. There's a great anxiety that shows up with this identification happening of, oh no, the source of all goodness is not me, it's
Right.
mom. And the source of all goodness and badness, which is an immense power, I look different than her. And there's an immense anxiety that shows up around that. And you couple that anxiety with a little boy's need to be held, to be contained, to be taken in, to be received. And the anxiety that he might be rejected, the alternative to tolerating that anxiety goes, well, I couldn't be rejected. I couldn't possibly be rejected because I don't need to be received. I don't need to be welcomed. I don't need to be desired. I'll just be the only desirable thing I need. I'll just find my own needs.
I alone can fix it.
I alone. Yeah, exactly. And that goes back to, I think, what I was talking about of how important it is for me to be in dialogue with these parts of myself that I hold very, very tightly to and don't want to let go. It means to feel it, to feel all of it, to feel the impact I'm having, and to feel how desperately I want to not feel that impact. I think that's the sort of like narcissistic dance, is to like be in touch with one's own self when relationship penetrates.
Yeah, something you said made me think about the oscillation of the capital N narcissist going between their own idealization and devaluation.
Yeah.
And if you've ever seen like a narcissistic crash, it's quite startling. Yes. It can be violent, but I also thought of a client who told me for a good year about how his job, was just jealous of him. And then he got fired and sat in silence for 40 minutes straight in our session. That devaluation that comes on the crash after the idealization.
Real collapse.
Yeah.
Like a deep collapse.
And the dance that you're referring to, which is like a more helpful dance of maybe the lowercase n narcissist, of like recognizing the impact I have and also the needs I have.
Yeah. If you see little kids operating, it's really easy to see narcissism at play.
I'm aware.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's developmentally appropriate. One of the things that I realized about parenting a toddler that relates is that I'm uniquely bad at it because through therapy and through being a patient over a decade, I learned all of these coping mechanisms for the capital N narcissists, plural, in my life. And then I encounter my child, a toddler, but I realized that if I can't set up this guard in this wall for my child. And, it was a really helpful realization to realize my child isn't reminding me of the people I've set up the guards towards. The people I've set up the guards toward are reminding me of toddlers. That's what's happening.
Absolutely.
They haven't grown out of it. and it's no longer developmentally appropriate for them.
Yeah.
It's developmentally appropriate for her.
Yeah. I think why this conversation doesn't really happen very often, which I hope I don't say with some kind of like omnipotent narcissist, whatever. But I think a part of why this conversation doesn't happen, for good reason, is there's a lot of taboo that we're inviting deconstruction of.
Yes.
And the taboo being around how important it is to see narrative in behavior. Until it's narcissism. It's useful to think in terms that there's developmentally appropriate narcissism and psychopathy. But if we think in terms of narrative, like narratively appropriate narcissism, now we're talking about compassion for somebody's history, which is very uncomfortable and unattractive. It's unattractive to me to have compassion for Trump.
Right.
It's unattractive for me to try to have any kind of compassion for what got him to be so goddamn lonely.
Right.
Very little compassion for what he perpetuates of that loneliness. To have only hope in followers as opposed to relationships. His only hope seems to be in having worshipers or pawns or objects that he can use, as opposed to relationships that will penetrate him with an offer of empathy and love.
Yeah, or relationships that are mutual or reciprocal.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
I wonder why he keeps following me around and us around, and it's because of how rich with pathology, like irrelevant pathology, his story is.
Yeah, I think he's sort of become an archetype, which I hold the idea of archetypes rather loosely. I don't think they're the most helpful idea, but they can be really helpful as far as myths and a way to try to relate to ourselves. They serve a sort of diagnostic function that I think can be really unhelpful.
Well, that's interesting because I think what you're talking about, he is our boogeyman. But he's not for people like you and me. And not that we're special. We just see it and and you see it and you say, what a lonely little boy. And I see it and I say, yeah, his dad taught him that there's winners and losers. And if you're not one, you're the other.
Right.
And how sad that is. Yeah. Also, how sad that it affected so many people over the course of his lifetime in a negative way. But he's become a boogeyman. And then they, on the other side, have their boogie people, right? Like the immigrant or, the drag queen, which is the current boogie woman du jour.
Right.
There's a new outrage every season, whether it be critical race theory or... Yeah.
I think I trade heroes the way they trade boogeymen. I think I fantasize which hero I need to idealize.
When is it? Is it me?
Well, it was for a long time. Neville Symington replaced you.
How was that for narcissism?
Capital N. That was capital.
Yeah. I'm sure that this distinction came from a former professor or a supervisor, or maybe even the first time I read Neville Symington. But I'm using the word narcissism in two different ways in this conversation. When I talk about the capital N narcissist, I'm referring to someone whose personality has become intertwined with their narcissism and cannot act apart from it for very long. When I talk about the lowercase n narcissism, I'm talking about the defense that arises in times of crisis that says, but what about me? How will this affect me? I can honestly say that lowercase narcissism is rampant in myself, even as a father and a husband. The way that babies shift the family constellation is massive, and having just passed Father's Day as I'm recording this, I've been reflecting on what it means to be a supportive father. I think that for me, it means to try my best to quiet that defense, the panicky part that in the last 4 years has gone from being the most important other person in my house to the third most important other. To breathe through that or direct it at a different source, like a therapist. But I don't describe that form of narcissism ominously. It's in all of us, and certainly rampant in us in times of change, like when we're toddlers and our internal world is exploding with growth. I hear clients all the time worry about their own narcissism or their spouse's narcissism. And it's often this kind of defense. Because when you meet the capital N narcissist, it's often clear as day, unless they're deceiving you. And as much as I'm sick of talking about the last US president, he's a great example of someone who was not deceiving us very well.
Tim Dean and Oliver Davis, their book Hatred of Sex references Rancière, a French philosopher's book, Hatred of Democracy. And what he gets at, I think that there's anxiety everywhere within our cultural milieu because, especially within democracy, there is something to hate about it by its very nature. What they talk about, referencing Rancière's idea of hatred of democracy, is that within the very nature of democracy is the rabble, are the deplorables. Mm-hmm. The deplorables are not a problem for democracy. They're a part of its nature. So when Hillary says what she does about trying to bifurcate the true Democrats or the true members of the Republic, the true people who are entitled to a vote because they take it seriously, or something like that. What Rancière gets at is that is a hatred of democracy. The idea that what is disordering in our minds is a part of its very nature.
Right.
I think there's something about Trump that has us glued because of what is disturbing in us about our own needs for attention, our own needs to be to escape rejection, our own need to be celebrated, to be wanted. And that need, I think we hate in ourselves.
Right.
And we want to get it out of us, and so we have an anxiety about it. And so when we see it in anybody else, especially with how loud it is in him, I think we get glued. It's the same way why I think we're actually attracted to feeling disgust.
Well, it's just a strange thing to see that ownership of that having kind of switched over political sides, because I think of like a lot of what the queer liberation movement being about accepting that, accepting our naughtiness and our badness, and accepting our queerness, and accepting our shameful parts. I feel like the righteousness of our society has moved political spectrum, and on the political spectrum. We had this president that was like scandal free and pretty excellent at being a family man and being competent and well spoken and respectful for 8 years. And then we had this president who was like sleeping with porn stars and like
Paying them off.
And then, saying, whatever came to mind without a filter. And then that was kind of valorized. Right. I like how he speaks his mind. Now I'm hyper conscious of, do we sound like old white straight dudes?
Yeah, I feel really good about a lot of the way that we're becoming sensitive. I also think that we're losing something at the same time. Trauma has never been something respected in the cultural milieu like it is now. Traumatic experience and traumatic history and traumatic narrative has never been respected like it is now. And that feels like a victory.
My wife and I, we watch a lot of garbage reality TV because of the 3 brain cells we have as parents. And it's remarkable how often I hear young people on those shows accuse the other of gaslighting them when it's that they're disagreeing.
Yeah.
I think it diminishes the actual event that happens when someone has manipulated someone into trusting them above themselves.
Yes. The experience of losing your own mind to trust in a relationship has a deep potency. At the same time, maybe in the flatness of our English language, there is something fantastic about the democracy, the democratizing of language, to where there's something that using that term more casually actually might get to also.
Yes, and that's the thing that I ultimately land on with any of these complaints is that anytime an old white guy like me complains about the way things are changing, what I'm doing is I'm complaining about the nature of time. Culture moves through time, and things that were once considered, insider knowledge and expert language become democratized and become the vernacular. Yeah. And they start to change meaning as they become the vernacular. And that happens with every niche
Absolutely.
group of, terms and languages. So there's nothing weird about it, and there's nothing pathological about it.
As the effort to decolonialize language and decolonialize any and everything that possibly could be, there's a kind of resurrecting and purifying fantasy that goes along with all of that, that I feel like I need to do well to be a steward of, like, how I can help and be a part of that.
Sure.
And at the same time, the fantasy that we can purify seems very colonial to me. The fantasy
Make
that
America great again.
Yeah,
all comes back.
Yeah, maybe so.
Right? I mean, that's the fantasy, right? Is that we can go back. We can go back to a more pure state.
Yeah, there's something very uncomfortable about lots of parts of this conversation. I think I have a fantasy that at some point we can get to a place where we acknowledge and accept how utterly out of control we are, and how utterly dependent we are on each other. How there is going to always be loss, and we are never going to be able to prevent it.
Yeah.
Every time there's an awful experience that happens that renders us mindless and crazy with rage or disgust or powerlessness. In the midst of the grief and processing the powerlessness, I find myself hoping for a time where it doesn't feel like a violation of our existence to lose. It doesn't feel like a violation of our existence to need help. And I could say for myself, it doesn't feel like a violation of my existence to need help and to fuck up and to not get it right, and to have things done to me that I couldn't have predicted.
Which comes back to all the work you've done regarding your own narcissism. That, like, failure is not bad. Having needs is not bad.
And it can be deeply disappointing to experience losing hope in me in relationship.
What does that part mean? Say that again.
That's the relational failures, I think, that can come with relationship with me. I can love well, and I can also be deplorable. There are parts of me that fail relationship. Hell, I can barely speak well. My words fail. So often it feels like I'm barely able to speak well.
I feel compassion for you in that it also speaks to an unrealistic standard, right? No one should expect your words to be perfect. It's a fantasy itself.
Sure, yeah.
That for your clients or for your loved ones, or that your words would never fail.
Yeah. I think to go back to the grief I was talking about earlier, sometimes I think in our deepest grief we end up being highly sensitive to the places in us that have anything to do with what we're grieving. Sort of like the way that I think disgust and shame are the flip of the same coin. What we find judgeable in ourselves, we find disgusting in the other. I also think that when we're in grief, we can be highly reactive to anything having to do with our grief in the world around us, and then in our relationships. And I think a big part of the sort of latent and acute at different points in time grief I have been like in for years around different aspects of my early life just make me very sensitive to what it is to feel incapable in relationship, what it is to feel not enough, and to recognize literally being not enough, like the reality of not enoughness.
Well, I certainly identify with that, especially in parenting.
I bet.
With clients too, but more so in parenting.
I think it's a part of the work is the dance of believing that there is something worth offering, that our minds have something very, very good to offer, as well as the reality that there's always the chance of being not enough. And in fact, it may be an essential experience for a patient to experience you devoted in a deep way and willing to be in that place, hopeless.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm just remembering that I had a client tell me the other day, I said something like, "Is that helpful?" And they said, "Yeah, I just thought I was going to get a lot more insight than that."
Yeah. Yeah.
And I said, "Well, sorry." How are you liking your job these days?
Oh, I love it.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely. It's so hard.
That sounds like a Caleb response. I love it. It's so hard.
Yeah, it's intense, man. It's really something to be so idealized and so de-idealized, to be so like liked and hated, and to feel like such heartbreak and hope and disorientation and fucking cluelessness throughout a 7-session day.
Right.
Especially when feels like there's something in the water. I try to look into, are there any patient experiences that you're having that have you feeling like you have to give more than you want to, or like you don't get to have a self that says no?
100%. I mean, I can think of multiple.
And then that ends up sort of leaching into the field. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think with the pandemic, I really got loose around some of my framework. Little things like...
All of us did, I think.
Yeah, little things like, going easy on a cancellation, or going easy on, this policy, or... I started to give in places where I wouldn't necessarily give. And then it kind of became, I think, the new standard.
The loose frame got stuck.
Yeah. And so I found myself feeling at times resentful, but really resenting myself more than anyone for letting myself get there.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, that's the person who's the most responsible for it.
I'm always curious when our patients are catching the blame, what it is about what the patients are getting to us that has us blaming them. What is it that is getting to you?
Yeah. That's
gotten to you? You've been penetrated by something. You're not happy with having it in you.
Yeah.
I don't know. Does that land in any way?
100%. And I can't say it on the podcast, but I'll tell you the real examples afterward.
Yeah.
Okay, Caleb. Thanks a lot for being on my first in-person interview in years.
Yeah. Yeah. It's good to talk to you. I didn't say it before, but I appreciated your compassion and wanting to remind me of goodness, my goodness.
Us oldest brothers gotta watch out for each other.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
This has been Between Us. Our thanks to our guest, Caleb Williams. Between Us is produced by myself, John Totten, and Mason Neely, who also composes our music. Our research assistant is Rose Bergdoll. Thanks to everyone who stuck with the show and spread the word during our long hiatus. We're happy to be back. If you like the show, make sure to find it where you find podcasts and subscribe. And please keep leaving reviews. And until next time, take care.